It was times of turmoil, times of security. Some wanted progression, but others did not. It was the age of identities, change, and irony. It was 1960s and 70s Canada.
Hi, this is Julia.
And this is Louis.
We're going to talk about Canada in 1960s and 70s. First, social change. By early 1960s, teen culture emerged. Because of the baby boom after World War II, the adults didn't have much choice but to embrace the teen culture. Because half of the population consisted of young people, and this phenomenon was also called as youthquake. Teen culture was the counterculture, which opposed the traditional values of the old culture. For example, there were Beatles, who were British singers. They introduced rock music and new style of hairstyle and clothing style. There were many protest songs, and the singer was Bob Dylan and other various singers. And hippies introduced slogans such as "Make love, not war." These all rejected traditional social values such as materialism and respect for authority. However, in 1980s, all of these phenomena vanished because the majority of the people influenced by these pop culture became 30s and 40s, and they needed to find jobs and families. Women's movement. During World War II, women replaced men in jobs. However, as the World War II ended, men came back and they replaced women. Women were forced to return to their traditional roles, such as housekeeping. Even if they worked, they only got trivial and unimportant jobs, such as waitressing. In 1963, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, a bestseller. Feminists started to speak up. In 1967, due to the pressure, P.M. Pearson set up the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. Basically, it was about the gender equality. The NAC fought for the inclusion of guaranteeing women rights in Canadian Charter. Civil liberties. Diefenbaker introduced Canadian Bill of Rights in 1960. It protected persons' fundamental rights, such as freedom of religion, speech, and assembly. In 1969, Pierre Trudeau, introduced Omnibus Bill. It included right of contraception, abortion, homosexuality, and also PM Trudeau changed the divorce law later. It was really progressive at that time, and he was criticized by that. However, these days, those rights are so fundamental in our lives.
Politics and government. In the 1960s, Canadians wanted a new leader who would appeal a new generation of voters. The result was Pierre Trudeau, who came to power by the youth vote. Please turn to the next page of the PowerPoint. D.F.M. Baker versus Pearson. D.F.M. Baker and Pearson had distant policies of Canada, creating fierce rivals. The rivalry lasted for 10 years, fighting 4 national elections. D.F.M. Baker was passionately committed to what he called Canadianism. It means a belief in the equality of all Canadians, whatever the heritage is. Pearson and his Liberals appealed to younger voters, especially Central Canada. As a result, Pearson won the election in 1963, modernizing Canada, and including the abolishing of capital punishment and easier divorce laws. Most of all, he introduced Canada's modern flag. Please turn to the next page of the PowerPoint. Canadians thought the Red English was too British to be a symbol of the new modernized Canada. English Canadians wanted to keep the old flag, while French Canadians wanted a new one. The new flag was raised on February 15, 1965, on the Parliamental Hill. Ironically, English Canadians regarded the flag with pride and affection, while Quebec, disillusioned by the debate, continued to fly the old flag. Please turn to the next page of the PowerPoint. Social welfare. Pearson's government continued to expand on the social welfare programs created by Mackenzie King. This was a way to keep the support of voters who remember the Depression and were attracted to the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, CCF. Pearson introduced universal health care, the Medical Care Act. Please turn to the next page of the presentation. Trudeau, a new-style politician. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a French-Canadian who was a strong federalist. He appealed to many young Canadians by his relieved and witty character. Trudeau was a hippie, dated celebrities, and hung out with famous people, and eventually became an international celebrity himself. He became Prime Minister of Canada in 1968. This was a time when radical separatists were becoming more violent. Trudeau believed that Canada should be a just society for all Canadians. The government should protect their rights and freedoms and foster their economic and social well-being.
The birth of separatism. Quebec was frustrated with the perceived injustice at the hands of English-speaking Quebec, with grievances as why was Ottawa the capital and why were most people speaking English? Why didn't Francophones have the right to have French schools and hospitals in the rest of Canada? And why were they expected to speak English in stores and at work? So like groups like the FLQ, Front de Libération de Québec, and the PQ, Parti Québécois, were formed, and the groups wanted to separate from Canada. The October Crisis. Pierre Elliott Trudeau disliked the idea of separatism. In October 1970, the FLQ kidnapped British diplomat James Cross and Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte. Trudeau imposed Wartime Measures Act to go against the group, and he was quoted saying, "Just watch me," when they asked him what he was going to do. Federal troops patrolled Ottawa and Montreal. Hundreds of pro-separatism Quebecois were arrested, and the FLQ ended up killing Pierre Laporte. Then they negotiated their safe passage to Cuba and they would release James Cross. Robert Bourassa and Bill 22. Robert Bourassa took power in Quebec. He passed Bill 22, which protected the status of the French language. He made French the official language of Quebec, forced many professionals and businesses to move because they were now forced to speak in French rather than English. And many Quebecois felt that Bourassa didn't do enough, and the Liberals lost to the Parti Québécois. And the decision to changed the policy where at work and in stores they were supposed to speak English, drove a lot of people to Toronto, which made Toronto be a business hub, pretty much. The PQ in power. 1976, PQ dominates and takes power in Quebec. Passed Bill 101, which states that French should be the only language in the province, and government employees had to speak in French. Commercial outdoor science would be in French only. Children of immigrants would be required to attend French schools. And this was viewed as extreme by the rest of Canada.
Moving on to economic changes. The problem of inflation. An oil embargo was imposed by the OPEC, Organization of the Petroleum Expanding Countries, due to the war between Israel and its neighboring Arab countries. A huge increase in the price of oil caused a round of inflation that would last most of the 1970s. As the Canadian dollar fell steadily, the prices of goods went up steadily, and the unemployment rate went from 3 to 5% to 12% by 1983. Regionalism. As Canada's prosperity decreased, provinces and territories fell into disparity. Many workers were laid off due to the lack of money to pay them. Many people in Western Canada believed that Ottawa policies were favoring central Canada at the expense of the West. The tension between the provinces grew worse than ever. Expanding horizons. During the 1970s, Canada believed that they relied on the US too much and tried to find new trading partners overseas. However, Canada was turned down since the country showed little interest in trading with Canada. Canada had to accept the reality that it relies on the US and is one of the main trade partners in Canada. The environmental movement. Canada's prosperity costed its environment. North Americans soon realized the result of pollution that caused environmental damage. Businesses and companies at first refused to limit the pollution however, awareness and concern grew. Therefore, the limits of pollution were put to use. Moving on to the next topic, a more independent international policy. As the Cold War continued during the 1960s, tensions developed between Canada and the US, and later the Vietnam War further worsened Canada's relations with the US. The nuclear issue in Canada. In 1963, the Conservative Party was divided onto the issue of whether or not Canada should become a nuclear nation or a non-nuclear nation. The Minister of External Affairs believed that Canada should be a non-nuclear nation, while the Defense Minister believed that nuclear weapons were a vital part in protecting Canada against communist aggression. In October 1962, U.S. surveillance showed that the USSR was installing offensive nuclear missiles in bases in Cuba, which resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Moving on to the Vietnam War. The Canadian government tried its best to stay neutral during the Vietnam War. In 1972, Americans began to withdraw as Vietnam was divided in half. North Vietnam was led by a communist leader, while the South had a more dictator than a democracy. Trudeau's foreign policy. The Vietnam War and the Cuban Missile Crisis heightened the differences between American and Canadian foreign policies. Trudeau took steps to scale back Canada's participation in nuclear arms race between the Soviet Union in hopes that it would cease the Cold War tensions. From 1970 to 1972, Canada's NATO forces gave up their nuclear missiles in Europe. The national defense budget was also cut down by 20%. However, Canada continued to participate in NATO and NORAD alongside the US. Canada's international profile. Throughout Trudeau's period in office, the The Cold War continued to dominate the international affairs. As a middle power, Canada could build relations between the East, the West, the North, and the South. Trudeau's efforts to reduce nuclear weapons and establish trade. In 1968, a new government body was known as the International Development Agency, also called CIDA. The CIDA's responsibility was to boost foreign aid to less industrialized countries. The Cold War renewed. In 1972, a strategic arms limitations talk between the US and Soviet Union signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And an interrogation agreement between the strategic offensive arms. This marked a breakthrough in relations between the Soviet Union
Opinions and analysis of 1960s and 70s Canada. Hi everyone, it's me again. I'm here to present my opinion about the 1960s and 70s Canada. While preparing for this project, the thing that interested me the most was the hippies movement. Like any other social phenomenons, hippie movements had its advantages and disadvantages. The positive part of hippie movement was that it promoted the sense of nationalism. Hippies voiced their opinions through slogans such as US troops get out of Vietnam, and they were against the American foreign policy. This promoted the Canadian independence from the US. Not only this, the hippies fought nonviolently for new values such as freedom of expression, love, and peace. However, the negative aspect of hippie movements was that a lot of them no longer represented their initial values, such as love, peace, and nonviolence, and some of them became hedonists, and they only followed the pleasures in life, such as the sexual pleasure or pleasures they could have from drug use. Not only this, hippies mostly gradually declined in the 1970s. Most of them realized that their values were too ideal. They grew up and they began to follow more practical values, such as getting a job or forming a family. Nonetheless, hippies movement was a huge part in Canadian history. However, in my opinion, it could have been more influential if the hippies had more precise strategy on how to change the society with their own values, and also
If they had adjusted their radical values a little bit, so that the other older and more powerful generation could also accept and embrace them, it would have been better. The older generation would have joined them to spread and actually apply the values of the hippies to the social structure. Overall, 1960s and 70s Canada were the time when everyone fought for their identities. Women, Aboriginal, radical youth, Quebec, and Canada as a nation itself struggled through various events to find their true identities. However, it is also ironic because despite these excessive efforts they had made, we still have the similar crisis in our modern society. Before ending this video, I'd like to read a quote for you. Silence never won rights. Rights are not handed down from above. Rights are forced by pressure from below. In terms of human rights, we should never fear to speak up, never cease to act, and never give up. Thank you. Hi, I've got 2 questions for you guys to think about. The first question: was hippie movement effective in terms of changing the society and promoting their values? If not, what kind of effective way could have the social activists used? The second question: 1960s and 70s were the age of change. Politically, liberalism was dominant. What factors contributed to this social phenomenon? In other words, why the public preferred liberalism to conservatism?